Scotland has a problem. We have the highest drug death rate in Europe.
Nearly died. I OD'd twice in space like 24 hours.
Over 1,000 alcohol-related deaths in 2020.
I just managed to get myself in that much of a state. It was, right, pack it in or you're a dead man.
2 in 3 adults are eating themselves into an early grave.
I'm eating it thinking that I'm treating myself. I'm eating it against my will.
And we are the gambling capital of Britain.
The money became secondary. I needed the money to gamble, and I felt like I couldn't stop gambling.
Why do we find it so hard to say no?
You're not in control. Your addiction's in control of you, mate, innit?
And what can we do to get better?
You feel like you're worth something here. You know, you're contributing to something.
Aye.
My name is Darren McGarvey, and I am an addict. In this episode, I'm going to find out what lurks behind some of Scotland's other addictions. Food, gambling, gaming, and sex. Known as behavioural addictions, they may lack the intoxicating chemical hooks and shivering withdrawals of drug and alcohol dependency, but nonetheless cause pain and distress to thousands of Scots. As someone who is trying to live a sober life, there's a certain vigilance that I have to bring to a number of areas around things like my thinking and behaviour around alcohol, drugs, some foods, and even things like pornography and sex. I found that one of the best outlets for me has been regular exercise. So whether I'm lifting weights, whether I'm running, the high that I experience is not as intense as, say, a line of cocaine, but there are no crushing lows associated with it. But you could argue that I've substituted one obsession or addiction for another. So I'm interested to know, are there any similarities between these seemingly distinctive behaviours? And ultimately, how does a behavioural addiction work? In my bumpy recovery journey, I've become aware that my addictive habits began much earlier than my use of alcohol or drugs. In fact, the first step for me, the seed that was planted in my brain, began in the most innocuous of ways. My wee granny's confectionery rituals were legendary in my family. She would tell my granddad that we were going for a loaf or something like that, and then often we would end up in cafes like this, absolutely gorging ourselves on delicious, tasty treats. Later in my life, during my kind of turbulent adolescence when I became estranged from family, I would attempt to recreate those feelings of contentment and joy and excitement with things like pastries, chocolate bars, and unscheduled trips to the chippy. Not as part of a social engagement, or sometimes not even because I was hungry, but just because I was lonely. I've learned that sometimes I eat to ease discomfort. This kind of self-soothing behaviour feels very familiar to me. It echoes strongly my habits and internal thought processes related to substances that I've been addicted to. But is it an addiction? I'm meeting Anne-Marie, who has overcome alcohol and drug dependency, but it's her relationship to food which has proved the hardest habit to break. So Anne-Marie, I wonder if we could just begin with you giving me a wee bit of your background in terms of where you've come from, where you've been.
My growing up in Easterhouse was really tough. I started using alcohol when I was 9.
9?
9.
Wow.
And that was the first time that I ever felt like I was untouchable. Untouchable, and also free from this inner world of mine that was just full of distress. And from that, I chased anything that would give me that same experience up until I was 46. But let me tell you, it's some time in my recovery from a range of different addictions, and the hardest one has been for me is sugar, right? Food. So Tesco have got these salted caramel mousse. Anyway, if I could marry it, I would. Instead, I just bathe in it. So I can buy a half a dozen and go through them. And feel sick. But I'm eating it thinking that I'm treating myself. I'm eating it against my will.
So you know that there are certain foods that you need to avoid because you experience a subsequent loss of control?
This is a really tender area for me to talk about because as a wee girl, my mum would put just one square of chocolate under my pillow. And that was to keep us quiet. That was a reward, that was to keep us quiet. And I can remember that from way back.
Keep you quiet in what sense?
It was around keeping silent, be a good girl, getting rewarded. And it was about control and containment.
Some people would dispute the possibility of a food addiction. What's your thoughts on that? Is it possible to be addicted to food?
I don't have any doubt at all that food is absolutely something that can trigger addictive behaviours because it's as serious to me as using alcohol or heroin. In fact, I was afraid that I was going to get diabetes because of the amount of sugar that I was putting into my body. To me, it's self-harm, and it's self-harm that I wish I didn't have and that I don't have any control over.
So Anne-Marie, with the insight she's gained as she works every day to keep her recovery going, asserts that food can elicit the same addictive responses as drugs and alcohol.
I thought she had a very universal definition of addiction which can be applied alcohol, drugs and behaviours, which is you set out to do one thing, you end up doing the other thing, experiencing remorse and ask yourself, why did I do that?
There are clear physical and mental dangers with regards to food addiction. Diabetes, weight gain, self-loathing and shame. But given that 2 out of 3 people in Scotland are overweight or obese, are we all addicted? There's got to be more at play here.
This is Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow, and while it's a little bit bigger than most high streets in Scotland, it doesn't differ too greatly in terms of one of its basic ingredients, which is cheap, easy junk food. Now, I just walked 300 metres and I counted 12 takeaway options. In Scotland more generally, there are 65 of these places per 100,000 of the population, which might not actually seem that much, but anybody who's ever tried to go on a diet will attest to how quickly these seemingly innocuous high streets turn into sensory obstacle courses. I'm on my way to meet food scientist Professor David Galley, who is going to try and help me understand why some of us find this food so irresistible. And in preparation, I've bought my own little bag of tasty treats, so let's go.
The man I'm about to meet is Chief Scientific Officer for Food Standards Scotland. He's tasked with improving public health by providing us with information about the food we eat. So I'm kind of dreading to hear what he thinks of the contents of this bag.
Lovely.
Right, given that we're in Merchant City, it's important for me to act like a bit of a wanker. This is how you summon your food in this trendy quarter of Glasgow. You don't even acknowledge the existence of a waiter or waitress type person. Right, I'm going to just tell you right now, like my mouth is like a car wash, right? So I'm already having an experience.
Getting the smells.
So I think I'm gonna go for the burger first. Whatever's going on with this burger, every single layer of it that I bite down into, I can experience in my mouth in terms of a texture or a taste. And often I find that food is so tasty, I start to eat it really quickly. So can you just talk me through the mechanics of this kind of food?
The key thing here is you're linking through to the innate human being desire to have your salt, your fat, and your sugar. And the moment that hits you in the mouth, that immediately is setting off release of chemicals in your body that are the serotonins, the feel-good factors, and then the dopamine to act as well on it and do it again. And because this sets off a reward cycle, right, there's pleasure in this, we as humans like that pleasure. The trouble is, the more weight we put on, there are studies showing that you build up a tolerance to it. So you don't get the same high from consuming that same burger and chips, right? The bit you're now missing is the hit, is the pleasure from it. So what do? You have a bit more.
The ice cream, the jalapeno poppers,
yeah, exactly.
mozzarella sticks.
Brilliant. The idea of your reward system being kicked off, it is the salt and the sugar and the fat combined. It is that triumvirate that's created, designed for your pleasure.
I'm surprised there's not a burger called a triumvirate, you know, like a big triumvirate. I would be like, right, okay, let's do this. And you know that there'll be someone at home right now, you know, kind of wiping a curry off of their chest with a piece of naan bread in their bed, right, crying into a tub of Ben & Jerry's, who'll be absolutely furious that you've suggested that they might be addicted to food. Mm-hmm. What would you say to them?
That's a really good question. I mean, we've all been there. But enjoy your curry and your Ben & Jerry's, but just next day have a salad, have something different, a light pasta dish, you know, mix it up. But realise that you are manipulated by it. Right, let's do the donut.
Oh, fucking hell. I can honestly say that I didn't intend to eat as much food as I ended up eating. And I really mean that genuinely on my kid's life. So I ended up consuming over 1,000 calories within half an hour. And as fun as it was at the time and effortless as it was, I now have all of the kind of physical and mental symptoms that you would associate with consuming that kind of food. Just a sort of residual regret, shame. What is interesting is that I went into that with a certain degree of understanding around my own boundaries around food, and still a part of my brain just seemed to check out once I started eating.
The unholy trinity of fat, salt and sugar plays a huge part in the ease with which I can stuff my face. But for me, this loss of will, this inability to control, has a lot in common with the patterns of behaviour I've experienced with substance abuse. Does brain architecture and biochemistry play a part in my unhealthy response to food in a similar way to alcohol or drugs? And what about other behavioural addictions like sex or gambling? I've come to see Dr. Lucy Troop from the University of the West of Scotland to find out exactly what's going on in our brains when we engage in these behaviours.
So, Lucy, how does a behavioural addiction differ from a substance addiction?
Really, the difference is that when we have a substance involved, we are often bringing in something that will directly change the chemical structure of the brain. Whereas when we have a behavioural addiction, it's the behaviour itself that's going to then have an influence on how the brain functions.
So the brain's reward system is set up to reinforce behaviours that ensure our survival. So things like eating food, engaging in sexual behaviour, social interaction. And when we do those activities, the brain produces dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that makes us feel good. And because we feel good, we want to repeat those behaviours, and we then are more likely to survive. With a substance addiction, the reward system is actually hijacked by chemicals. So, for example, heroin will make the brain create more dopamine, and our tolerance levels will increase, and we become less responsive to boring everyday survival stimuli and focus more on the drug that we're using. With behavioural addiction, we still see the brain's reward system getting hijacked, but instead of being a drug, it's now hijacked by an activity. So, for example, gamblers, just the laying on of a bet will increase dopamine levels.
Where there's dopamine, there's addiction. If you get an anticipatory feeling of positive surges when you encounter something behavioural, it's no different to those sort of anticipatory responses you get when you maybe are preparing to use a drug or to use alcohol.
These are things that people can't abstain from. How then do they manage a behavioural addiction when it's unrealistic for them to say, I'm never going to have sex, I'm never going to eat again? It's impossible.
You're never cured. You will live with that problem for the rest of your life. And so you're always going to be susceptible to relapse. And as you know, unless you've relapsed, you haven't really started to move towards recovery.
Can we retrain our brains? Can we effectively try and rewire our brains by becoming conscious of all of these processes and then trying to act in such a way as to reinforce different ways of thinking and behaving?
Yeah, absolutely. The brain is what we call plastic, so we can reinforce behaviours, we can encourage behaviours that will change the pathways in the brain that communicate. A classic example is cognitive behavioural therapy that engages you to think about what you're doing and to change the framing of the behaviour. And so, yeah, you absolutely can.
I'm just coming away from that in complete awe of the power of the human brain, because a behavioural addiction is acquired not through the introduction of some foreign substance, but simply through the reinforcement of behaviour and what that does at the level of the mind. And this is important for two reasons. One reason, that we get a real solid scientific understanding that no amount of moralising is going to fix. But second, it actually is a good basis for hope, because the mind is so malleable that whatever damage is done to it outside actually injuring it can be undone by the same processes. And this is really important for overcoming behavioural addiction or any other kind of addiction. You need to have hope that it's possible, and that becomes a light by which you navigate the labyrinth of your own mind.
Changing neural pathways doesn't just happen. It requires work by the individual and support too. Which brings me to an area in my life where I found behavioural addiction manifesting, but it's the behaviour I found hardest to seek support for.
At the not so tender age of 37, I remember a simpler world before the internet. I remember the long wait to establish a dial-up connection. And I recall the lengths you'd have to go to see a picture of a naked woman. Whether crumpled up magazines in park hedges or trashy tabloids in public toilets, these left me curious and titillated. I even took to drawing some dirty pictures myself. But even in a household where we were very much encouraged to express ourselves, sexual desire was an awkward and tricky topic to broach.
Secrecy provided the perfect context for my curiosity about porn to slowly develop into an addiction. I now believe that pornography has at times disfigured me mentally, spiritually, and physically. A sentiment echoed by Aidan, a sex addict in recovery.
How early did you encounter this mood and mind-altering substance?
You know, it's funny you say that, right? Because I always say that porn was the first drug I picked up. I was 10 years old. I had a family member who had tapes. It wasn't anything illegal, but it was hardcore. It was hardcore porn. And it gripped me instantly. I didn't even realise I was an addict at the time, you know.
And so, how are you defining addictive behaviour in this context?
It became a must-have. It became my go-to for self-soothing and comfort, escaping my reality. I got excited by it. I needed to have it. It was in a family member's house, so I was always making excuses to go to that house so I could watch it and consume it.
Through our pornography use, we can be creating potentially dangerous situations for ourselves, you know, whatever sort of side of a dynamic that we're sitting on. What's your experience with that?
So it led to very dangerous experiences for me. I ended up using what was called teen chat, and it was my first experience. I was like 13, 14, and it was my first experience with older men messaging me. And because I'd seen so much porn, I was desensitised to the nature of this and very naive to it. And it led to being groomed by an older man who I eventually met. And I'm not going into the graphic details of that, but that was life-changing, that experience for me. I can't say it was directly because of the porn, but certainly the porn set me on a path where that was acceptable, that an older man would say sexual things to me and it was okay as part of the conversation.
So what does recovery from porn addiction look like? Because you can't abstain from sex. I mean, some people obviously do for very specific reasons.
Yeah.
But it's a tricky one to navigate, isn't it? Because it's a very hardwired instinct.
Recovery from sexual addiction is harder for me personally than the substances. And the substances was a war, it was an absolute battle. And that's something I always have to maintain. But like, I'm still getting therapy now over the sexual addiction stuff. I had therapy yesterday about it. So this is ongoing for me. I would class myself as being in recovery from it, but quite early recovery from it.
I think the shame is a big part of it. And I think that's one of the big common themes around all these different areas of addiction, is wherever there is a stigma around a particular topic, it creates conditions for someone to have a secret life.
There was a time for me as well where I would visit sex workers, but it was never for the act of sex, it was always seeking out abuse. It's not a fetish, it's self-harming. It was part of my illness, and I've had therapy and realised it's linked to the grooming I went through. But because I was consumed by guilt and shame that I was involved in that lifestyle and I didn't know who I could go to. You know, it's a very tough subject, and it's only through intensive therapy that I've discovered a lot of my behaviours were linked to other things. And it was a behaviour I wanted to break. I mean, we've only just started to feel safer talking about substance abuse, you know? So this is a subject I think we need to, like, that's what we're doing now. Talk about it, make it safer, make help more readily available for people.
I think it's self-evident it takes courage to talk the way he does. I mean, would any of you do it? Actually, it'll probably be quite affirming for a lot of people out there just to know that they're not alone with this. In many ways, this is a mysterious social and cultural force in our society right now, and that's partly just because, you know, very naturally, sex is a private thing. So anything that is tied into sex is a private thing, and that makes talking about it or sharing at any level something that has to be navigated with care and sensitivity.
An Ofcom survey from September 2020 found that 50% of adults in the UK watched online porn in the first months of the pandemic. That's 26 million people. Now, not every user on these sites is an addict, but by the law of averages, some of these people are suffering with sexual issues, including sex addictions. Psychosexual therapists are one of the very few services out there that offer support to people who can recognise and admit that they have a problem. I've come to meet Pauline Brown, who deals with these sorts of cases every day.
Nice place.
How are you this morning?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
It must be tremendously challenging for men and women to come to you with these issues, but then that might be indicative of the sense of desperation that they feel.
Yes, if people are addicted to substances, some substance, whether it's pornography or alcohol or cocaine, it does matter what the substance is, but it's the deeper pain that they're probably trying to soothe and run away from.
And what do you find that these are? Because I'm trying to look for patterns, and often something that predisposes people to a compulsion, which is harmful, is early childhood trauma, social deprivation and things like this.
There's three areas that can lead people to porn addiction. Trauma, as you say, trauma, sexual trauma, and trauma around poverty or other life issues, neglect, poor attachments, not having enough love and care in their backgrounds. The third one with porn is the opportunity and how that has manifested and opened up an area of addiction that we wouldn't have seen before. So there's a small group of young men predominantly who, but for the opportunity of the internet, probably wouldn't have gone down the porn addiction route.
You know, I've got experience of a number of these areas, including with pornography. And one of the things that I've found so alluring about it is not the act of gratification that's associated with it. It's that zombie-like state beforehand when you're looking through it.
We call it edging. Some people can edge for 5-6 hours, delaying gratification and the release of tension through orgasm. It's the seeking that is the buzz, that is the addictive element. And part of the cycle, that once the high is over, you hit this place of self-loathing, this real shame and guilt and really feel self-disgust that people get into, which then fuels the cycle because that sends them back round the path of needing to self-soothe again to get away from feeling so awful. You know, it's easy to say, yes, people have choices, but if you're caught up in a cycle of addiction, I don't think sometimes you do have that choice. The ability to make those sensible decisions go out the window.
It's an all too familiar refrain from my experiences with drugs and alcohol. A pattern emerges, a seemingly endless loop of shame and self-soothing, which causes more shame, and on it goes. The difference between porn and illegal drugs is that you can't get heroin on your phone all day free of charge.
It's not to say we should ban porn or ban things. It's about saying, what's the appropriate level of accessibility? What are the health risks associated with this? Not just for the people using the thing, but for the people around them and the community and the impact on services. And, you know, she sort of confirmed my intuition that this mass access to free, powerful, hardcore pornography is just a time bomb waiting to go off.
Believe me when I say I don't want to be the moral panic guy. But with pornography, it does feel like technology is making it easier for us to indulge our most primal urges 24/7. And it's not the first time technology has had an effect on a potentially addictive behaviour. Before the 1960s, the only place that you could legally put a bet on a horse was at a race course.
Fast forward 60 years, and the gambling industry is worth £5.9 billion. Over half of that eye-watering sum comes from online gambling. Now, while lockdown has obviously shored up some of those numbers, the fact that we potentially all have a bookies in our pocket means that placing a bet no longer even requires us to get dressed of a morning. To find out how we got here, I'm going to speak to Professor Heather Wardle of University of Glasgow.
Nearly half the population engage in gambling. Harmless fun for most, maybe a weekly lottery ticket or a workplace sweep for the Grand National. It's become so accessible, over a tenth of gamblers don't realise they're gambling.
Heather, they take me to some really weird places when I'm doing these programmes, but I'm absolutely clueless about what a train has to do with gambling.
Yeah, it might seem quite tangential, but the trains and the railroads were really important to the establishment of gambling as a commercial entity. When they started to open up in the mid-19th century, they basically allowed the movement of people between town and country, so people could get out to the race courses, you could have more events, it became a spectator sport. And of course, with that, there were more opportunities for people to gamble and bet, so they became really, really popular.
What has been the kind of legislative journey in terms of gambling? So we have quite a pivotal piece of legislation in the 1960s. What does that do in terms of gambling?
The 1960s legislation, so specifically the Betting and Gaming Act, you know, that completely revolutionised the way that gambling was provided in Britain. Pretty much overnight, you saw the commercial gambling industry, as we now see it today, being born, and over 10,000 bookmakers opened in that immediate aftermath of that legislation being passed.
By the way, one thing that you won't be able to do is what I'm doing now, because Clause 4 of the Act makes it an offence to loiter outside a bookie's office. Let's go inside.
Back when that piece of legislation was passed in the 1960s, there was this real sense of the government saying, look, we'll let you gamble, but we're not going to approve of it. We'll tolerate it. What was then set into law was that quite tight restrictions about the way that bookmakers' offices should look. So they should be quite austere. You didn't have the windows so people could see in. They were fairly kind of grim places to be visiting. So they tried to kind of discourage you in that way, but while still making it legal. And that was the sense that pervaded through all of gambling up until the 2005 Gambling Act that changed all of that. You went from this situation to what you could almost describe as a state-sponsored policy of normalisation, whereby gambling was then to be encouraged.
The story today is really about turning gambling into a mainstream leisure activity enjoyed by thousands and thousands of people, rather than it being a sort of guilty secret.
And now the UK government is looking at this issue again. What are they looking at, and what are your hopes for that legislation?
The government and other organisations have suddenly realised that actually the harms from gambling are much broader than they had originally anticipated, and that maybe gambling isn't this leisure and recreation activity that everybody should be doing. For me, I think there is a real tension at the heart of government around this.
It's big money for the Chancellor, isn't it?
And it's big money because they are taking the taxes. They want to get the revenue, they want the industry to grow, but they also want to protect people from harms. And there is a fundamental question about, can you do those two things simultaneously?
The thing that was really hitting home when I was talking about the development of gambling with Heather was just how radically it was transformed by technology and the acceleration of technology. And that sort of hammers home a broader point for me about society in Britain and in Scotland beginning to change at such a pace that you almost kind of sympathise with politicians who struggle to keep up with it. But when you look at something like gambling, what you see is politicians cut into the action in some way, the national lottery, all of the revenue that comes from gambling taxes. And so then what you're dealing with is perverse incentives. There are moral hazards here. And while obviously that's a big, broad picture question, the harm happens at the individual level.
Admittedly, I don't gamble myself. It's always seemed to me to be the addiction with the least bang for your buck. So I'm entering a culture which is relatively new to me.
For a bit of anecdotal evidence, I decided to jump on that internet and search for online gambling. And I was immediately bombarded by an array of enticing ads promising free spins, extra bets, and odds boosts. Now, I don't have a clue what any of those things are, but even I sort of found, oh, hang on a minute, this looks a bit fun. So I wonder what it would be like for somebody who was trying to get free of gambling addiction. I'm going to meet Darren, another Darren, who 7 years ago was spending as much as £500 a time on the roulette machine.
And his worst night, just 10 spins of the roulette wheel cost Darren £5,000. Fortunately, he's now in recovery, but the eye-watering sums he spent at the height of his addiction are not that exceptional for a gambling addict. Just 5% of gamblers account for 90% of the money the gambling industry takes.
How old were you when you started gambling?
Well, I've always had an association with gambling since I was a kid. It would be putting on, accumulators and football bets at the weekends with my pals when I was a teenager. And that's when it was all very normal and quite a controlled thing. But then things started taking more of a turn when you had your access to online.
You hear a lot of people that I've spoken to, they describe the early phase as being almost a kind of social event.
Well, absolutely, and couldn't be further from the truth. It's such an isolating, lonely and scary place to be because you get very stuck in your own head and you become very insular. It's like mental warfare. Every single day you're thinking about when you can put your next bet on. And the dangerous part is when you're on your own, in the house, and you've got unlimited access to open as many accounts as you want with the bookies and just pile in as much money as you possibly can.
Can you describe, for you personally, what the buzz was like doing it?
See, the misconception is that when you're gambling, everybody's chasing a jackpot. For me personally, it wasn't about the money anymore. I went on to later learn that I essentially rewired my brain, where I was getting a high off the dopamine hits. So even if I lost, I would get a very similar high to what I would get is when I win. And the draw of that is so strong that you keep coming back for more. But the reality is that only lasts a certain amount of time, and it just becomes habitual and very compulsive. That's the scary part. I was stuck in that cloud for months to years, and the money became secondary. I needed the money to gamble, and I felt like I couldn't stop gambling.
Where do you go for help?
In Scotland, there's a critical lack of understanding and services available to you here. We don't even have a treatment centre. There's nothing on the NHS that you can go to. And until gambling is treated as a public health concern, unfortunately, we're moving very, very slowly in no particular direction at the moment.
Research has found that gambling addicts are 3 to 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than other types of addict. Between 4 and 11% of all suicides are gambling related. In the UK, that means between 250 and 650 suicides every year. With figures like that, it's not surprising that those affected are keen to stamp out gambling advertising, something which is particularly prominent in football. Darren has invited me to join the Big Step. They're on a 3-day march around Scotland, visiting 10 grounds to make their case. I joined them on the walk to Tynecastle, where I spoke to the group's founder, James Grimes.
Tell me about the role that you think advertising plays in making this problem worse.
Huge role, and it's the reason we do this. I speak from my own experiences, but a lot of the guys behind me would testify that advertising was our way in to gambling addiction. But not just that. Once you're gambling, if you're constantly being encouraged to do it, it works. And the reason they spend £1.5 billion a year on it is because it works and it has impact. And it's very difficult to cut down on something when you live in a society which is constantly telling you to do that thing.
Can you describe to me some of the advertising techniques? Because there are a lot of people out there who either gamble safely or who have no experience of it whatsoever.
You've got sponsorship and branding, which I think adds to just the normalisation of it, but there's more direct marketing as well. And the reality is, gambling companies don't leave you alone once you're in that system. So I used to get 20 texts a day. I used to get emails saying, here's a free spin, here's a free bet. There's no such thing as a free bet, I can tell you that.
We're in Tynecastle. I have to commend how welcoming the staff here were to the marchers, because it's very unusual for a big organisation or company to do anything except dispatch a security guard to threaten you off the premises. So that's encouraging. The reason may be that Hearts are already on board. Since 2014, they have taken no direct money from gambling companies.
A whole mince pie down there. Untouched, not even by a seagull. This is what I mean about Edinburgh, do you know what I mean? Just something about it fundamentally I just don't understand. It seems to me that this is actually one of the most predatory industries out there, and that it differs from alcohol and drugs in the sense that it's completely unfettered. There's no attempt to restrain it. So this is absolutely one of those situations, like with alcohol, like with drugs, like with firearms, like with uranium. There are certain things that the government has rules about because it understands the potential harm caused, and we're going to need to have a think about that in relation to gambling for sure.
In the UK, the industry is regulated by the Gambling Commission, whose spokesperson said preventing gambling-related harm is at the heart of their work, and they've introduced a number of measures, including a clampdown on online slots, increased online age verification, and banning gambling on credit cards. In 2022, these and other measures have led to 7 operators paying out more than £20 million in fines. We also approached the Betting and Gaming Council, whose spokesperson said research did not establish a causal link between exposure to advertising and the development of problem gambling, and that customers only receive promotions if they request to do so and can opt out at any point. They added that the industry provides sport with vital funding, as well as supporting research, education and treatment services. But it feels like the gambling industry is already one step ahead of legislators. And in the search for new customers, it's spreading its tentacles into a much younger, massively successful industry.
This might surprise some of you because it certainly surprised me. But globally, the gaming industry is actually bigger than the film industry. So in the UK, it's worth £5.3 billion. And it was in Scotland that Rockstar North, creator of the second biggest selling game of all time, Grand Theft Auto, was founded. But the industry has come under increasing scrutiny in recent years for its use of loot boxes, a gaming mechanic which some claim has structural and psychological similarities with gambling.
I've come to meet student Johnny Pennyket, who found out to his cost just how addictive loot boxes can be.
Johnny, what the hell is a loot box?
So a loot box refers to a purchase where the outcome is randomised. When you're paying, you don't know what you're going to get. That big prize becomes a really kind of exciting and be a really addictive feeling.
So neurologically it's the same as a fruit machine or a roulette machine?
It is, absolutely, yeah.
In your case, the real story is where this addiction took you.
I've always been a football fan. The first video game that I played was FIFA. And then when I was 12 years old, EA introduced a mode into FIFA called Ultimate Team. And the concept of that is you want to build up your dream team of players to compete against other people. And these players can be found in packs, which are FIFA's loot boxes. And those packs can be opened again with a virtual currency, or they can be bought with real money.
Oh, what is this? Oh my God! We've got 92 Lewandowski! That's outrageous! Boys, I've only been opening packs for 20 minutes.
FIFA packs are a huge subculture among young boys especially.
Currently our total is £5,649. That's not actually that bad. This pack opening has gone very well.
There are YouTube accounts where they can watch their peers excitedly open pack after pack, seemingly having the time of their lives.
Oh!
When I was 17, I got a debit card for the first time, and that meant that my purchases could become instantaneous and impulsive, just a couple of buttons away. That was one really big turning point. The second was that when I was 17, my mum was diagnosed with cancer, and I was so desperately unhappy in my life and felt really, really alone. I ended up paying for the feeling of happiness, paying for the buzz and that rush of luck that I had felt since I was 12 years old.
How much, roughly, did you spend in the end?
Yeah, well, I'd be spending, £5 at a time here and there became more and more often, turned into £10, £20, £30 at a time, and then a few weeks before my exams when I was 18, I'd be putting £80 onto the game 3 or 4 times in one night, and the point came when the money just ran out. I thought I'd spent about £700, turned out I'd spent nearly £3,000 in total. And
this is money that other people had saved that was supposed to be for you, maybe buying a car or a deposit or something?
It was money, that my grandparents and my parents had worked really hard for to give to me as savings for the future. And I'll always remember that my mum told me that I'd broken her heart with the money that I'd spent. And
that must have been a sore one.
It was. I was so addicted to this process of opening packs that I actually was spending time when I wasn't on the game on a pack simulator in order to open hundreds of packs because I was just that addicted.
Well, even though you're not getting anything?
Absolutely. I was able to get a sense of that buzz that I loved just by using a simulator to open packs.
FIFA isn't the only culprit here. It's one of many games that use loot boxes. But in 2019, as a result of stories like Johnny's, the game's designers, EA, were asked to justify the practice before a parliamentary select committee.
This is something people enjoy. They enjoy surprises. And so it's something that's been part of toys for years, whether it's Kinder Eggs or Hatchimals or LOL Surprise. We do think the way that we have implemented these kind of mechanics, and FIFA, of course, is our big one, our FIFA Ultimate Team and our packs, is actually quite ethical and quite fun, enjoyable to people.
So just to be absolutely clear, your loot boxes or surprise mechanics, you have no ethical qualms whatsoever with.
So I think you're recharacterizing my language. What I said is I think the way we've implemented our FIFA Ultimate Team packs is ethical.
I think it's pretty obvious that what we're talking about here is gambling addiction, and it's very clear that the game developers that are including these loot box features in their games are very conscious of the revenue that's generated by it.
An EA spokesperson told us that in FIFA, spending is always optional and most players choose not to spend at all, and that they agree with the many regulators who have concluded that loot boxes are not gambling. They added that they will continue to listen to their community and invest back in the game to make it better and more fun for everyone. What about the people who come up with features like loot boxes and put them into games? I've come to Abertay University to speak to lecturer in game design Darren Ajayaman, someone who knows successful games don't always have to be predictable.
Maybe you could give it.
Okay, cool. What is it? What am I doing here? Who am I smashing?
I think it's
just a creative game.
Yeah. These are the ones that kind of push the medium.
Many of the students Darshana teaches will go on to find jobs in the big games companies. After my chat with Johnny, I'm curious to know if gamers' welfare is considered at all in the education of this next generation of software designers.
We found that people could become as addicted to an activity as they can to a substance. So if you've got mechanics in a computer game that are similar to the mechanics in a roulette machine, I mean, surely even there's just a kind of basic brain science argument that it is addictive.
I'm not so sure about the biochemistry of it, but people have described the possibility definitely for problematic use, for overuse, and dysregulated use. So they might sound like academic kind of like toing and froing about it, but I think it's important to make those sorts of distinctions. Generally, when people go to design a game, they want people to be engaged and kind of stick around. So a lot of those techniques, because game designers will talk about loops, gameplay loops.
For non-gamers out there, this is basically the cycle of, for a role-playing game, it might be exploration, then combat, then a bit of downtime, a wee bit of story, maybe a wee loot box, and then you're back in that again, aren't you?
And I think that breadth of activities that you've just mentioned, that's something that's really important to keep in mind, because the primary activity isn't gambling as such.
But there must still be a role for the gaming industry to play where the health of their consumers is concerned. What does that look like for gaming?
So I think that's something that the games industry itself is taking on board a lot more, which is heartening to see. And when we've been speaking to developers, there's a lot of people who want to know what's the research and how can we kind of like steer away from these riskier designs, and we need to know more about the players themselves. What are they getting from this?
I've come away from Abertay concerned that there's huge potential for the grey area around loot boxes and gambling to be exploited. I mean, the financial incentives are huge, aren't they?
But obviously anything that sort of lights up that pleasure centre can potentially become problematic. And the longer we wait to address that, the more dependent and the more addicted that industry will become on some of the revenue that's generated by the more problematic users. So I think maybe we could learn some of the lessons from the other areas and apply that to gaming as soon as possible so that we can have fun and also our kids are safe.
I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, Darren, why are you always on such a downer? Computer games were the one thing I had left that I thought wasn't bad for me, and now here you come to spoil that for me, I know. Well, my thumb-mashing friend, it's not all bad news. So here's a wee good news story for you, and it kind of blows my mind.
I'm on my way to meet Joe Donnelly, who has been a gamer since he was a kid. But Joe wants me to meet him not here in Scotland,
but here in the foothills of Grand Theft Auto 5's Mount Chiliad. Oops. First launched in 2013, the fifth incarnation in the GTA canon has been played by over 143 million people worldwide and is the second best-selling game of all time.
It's pretty vast, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a nice wee bit if you want to go for a wee quiet walk. We can climb up this mountain here.
I would never think to go hill walking in a game like this. I was just trying to steal my motors, mate. Do you know what I mean? You've opened my eyes. How did you come across this Mount Chiliad thing anyway?
There's a kind of subculture within the PC scene, role-playing scene, where people use the game almost in reverse. You know, that there's no law breaking. You by and large stick to the rules. You know, you stop at red lights. You try and hold down a job, which you can apply for at the job centre. And it's just basically appreciating the world of the game. And I happened upon this group completely by chance. There's a group of 5 of them, and they would meet up kind of in random intervals throughout the months and just wander about, and they would just have a wee chat about things that were going on in their lives, things that they'd kind of been struggling with. It ranged from somebody had lost their mother, another person had lost a relative who'd been knocked down, basically talking about the grief that they'd kind of struggled with and how that it was affecting them in real life. And given that I'm someone who's used video games to help my own mental health in real life, I thought it was wonderful that they were able to take, you know, the ingredients that Rockstar as a game developer has given them, and then really turning it on its head, you know, using it in such a sedentary, non-combative, non-hostile way.
Yeah, it's fascinating as well that it's happening in real time and it's occurring organically. You know, it just becomes a landscape, really, like any other landscape for minds to kind of meet, you know what I mean?
What I found really interesting about this group of people that were using the game in that way is they maybe weren't comfortable enough to be doing so in real life, you know, doing it face-to-face with real people. So by that anonymity that, you know, the avatar in a game like Grand Theft Auto, removing the stress and anxiety and the difficulties of sharing your feelings in real life.
And that is just lovely to look at, even.
Nothing beats the real thing, but it's conducive to what you could be doing if you were going for a hill walk to kind of clear your head or, you know, vent or get some things off your chest.
And there's the sun coming up just as we approach the peak.
There you go. It's beautiful, huh?
Aye, it is really nice. Really, really nice.
I'll race you to the top.
Right, okay. Then suddenly the competition begins.
Obviously, talking about your feelings as a man is really important, but sometimes you just need to knock somebody out on a virtual mountaintop. I did say this was a good news story. If there's one thing we don't have to feel guilty about being addicted to, it's our appetite to connect.
People need connection, social connection. It's a panacea for all sorts of problems that we experience as people. And without that, then we become like plants in the corner of a dark room, not being watered. We just kind of wither, and only by that reconnection can we get well and stay well.
That idea has long been a part of recovery communities, and it can be put into practice in the simplest of ways.
Spaghetti bolognese?
Yes, definitely.
Spaghetti bolognese, eh? They must have knew I was coming. I'm a basic bitch when it comes to food.
I've come to the Gal Gael in Govan to join their weekly community meal.
The community meals are sort of cornerstone of this community, isn't it? How important is such a simple thing like that to really kind of give it a shape to the community?
Oh, the meals are vital, but they're vital for creating that informality, that, you know, that we're not like another service, if you know what I mean. We're a place where we share food together and eat together, but it really allows people just to have informal conversations, tell their stories, build relationships and feel a sense of belonging.
The Gal Gael is a charity that believes in creating community by working and learning together. They offer activities, chiefly woodwork, that help people reclaim skills, agency and a sense of worth.
What is it that brought you here in the first instance?
I had a serious drink problem. You know, I'd been to the AA and they really hadn't worked for me. They don't work for everybody. And somebody mentioned this place, they kept mentioning it. And eventually I came down and I just fell in love with the place.
Obviously a lot of it is based not just around woodwork and stuff like that, but also being rooted into a culture, isn't it?
Yes, the culture of the Gal Gael is you do therapy through making things. And while you're working, then you talk about things to people, especially when you're surrounded by people who have had similar problems. And you're working away and you're chatting away and eventually that comes up. You know, it has to, I suppose, if it's a big part of your life. And that's where the therapy begins. At the end of the day, it cares.
Yeah.
You know, and you know it cares. And if you know it cares, then you can always come back.
A therapist once told me that the mind can't be in two places at once. We become prey to an addiction when we spend a wee bit too much time up here, alone, isolated from others. You can't think your way out of this problem. Believe me, even the smartest person in the world's best thinking will eventually get them drunk or high or whatever if they have this illness. And that is what this is, an illness. And it's one that we treat with honesty and connection and action. But this doesn't just apply to the individual person suffering with this problem. This applies to our society, our institutions, our politics and our culture. How can we look people struggling with this issue in the eye and implore them to take responsibility when we as a nation have for decades sought to deny the true scale of this problem and blame others? Sometimes life is about accepting the things that you cannot change. But sometimes it's about changing the things that you cannot and should never accept. Scotland, we have a serious problem, and I think it's finally time that we dealt with it.